Here to explain another misconception, which is the difference between domestic violence and domestic abuse. People often use the terms domestic violence and domestic abuse interchangeably, but doing that actually hides a deeper reality about how harm inside relationships truly works. The difference is not just about what happens, but how control is established and maintained over time. Domestic abuse is the system. Domestic violence is one of the tools used within that system. Domestic abuse is a pattern of power and control that one person establishes over another within a relationship. It is not defined by a single incident. It is defined by repetition, manipulation, and the gradual erosion of the other person's autonomy, identity, and sense of safety. In many abusive relationships, the abuse begins long before anything physical ever happens. At first, it can look almost invisible to outsiders. Sometimes it even appears as affection, protection, or intense love. The early stages may include excessive jealousy framed as caring, a wanting constant contact or updates about where someone is, discouraging time with friends or family, subtle criticism that slowly chips away at confidence, guilt-tripping someone for asserting independence. None of those things involve physical harm, yet they begin to shift the balance of power in the relationship. Over time, the abuser creates an environment where the other person feels increasingly monitored, judged, dependent, emotionally destabilized. This is where domestic abuse lives, in the control of someone's psychological environment. Domestic abuse can include several layers. Emotional abuse, attacking someone's worth, intelligence, appearance, or competence until they begin to internalize those messages. Psychological abuse, manipulation tactics like gaslighting, where the victim is made to question their memory, perception, or reality. Financial abuse, controlling money, preventing someone from working, sabotaging employment, or forcing financial dependency. Isolation, gradually separating someone from their support systems so they have fewer outside perspectives or resources. Intimidation and coercion, threats, unpredictable anger, destruction of objects, or behavior meant to instill fear without necessarily touching the person. These methods create something extremely powerful: control without visible violence. And this is why domestic abuse can exist for years while outsiders say things like, "Why are they still with that person? It can't be that bad if they aren't being hit." But the truth is that domestic abuse often works by slowly dismantling a person's sense of urgency before violence ever enters the picture. Once a person has been psychologically destabilized, isolated, and made to feel powerless or dependent, the relationship dynamic has already shifted dramatically. This is where domestic violence enters. Domestic violence refers specifically to the physical or sexual acts of harm within the relationship. These acts may include hitting, choking, pushing, restraining, throwing objects, using weapons, sexual coercion or assault, physical intimidation meant to cause fear of injury. Domestic violence is the visible eruption of the same power structure that domestic abuse quietly built. In many cases, the first act of violence is not random. It is often the moment when the abuser realizes they can escalate control without losing the relationship. Because by that point, the groundwork of abuse may have already created emotional dependency, fear of retaliation, financial reliance, isolation from support, deep psychological confusion. This is why people trapped in these situations often stay, not because they want the violence, but because the abuse has systematically narrowed their perceived options. Another critical distinction is this: domestic violence is event-based. It happens in specific moments. Domestic abuse is pattern-based. It shapes the entire atmosphere of the relationship. A single violent incident can be traumatic, but long-term domestic abuse can restructure how a person thinks, feels, and sees themselves. People living under chronic abuse may begin to experience loss of self-confidence, constant hypervigilance, difficulty trusting their own judgment, emotional numbness, fear of conflict or disagreement, a belief that they are somehow responsible for the abuse. In severe cases, the psychological damage can persist long after the relationship ends. So while bruises and injuries may be the most visible signs of harm, domestic abuse often leaves deeper and longer-lasting wounds that no one can see. Understanding this difference matters because many victims are told they are not in danger unless violence has already occurred. But the reality is that domestic violence rarely appears out of nowhere. More often, It is the final escalation of a pattern of abuse that has been quietly tightening control for months or years. Recognizing the early signs of domestic abuse is often the only way to prevent the situation from ever reaching the point of violence. And that is why the distinction matters. Because the real danger in these relationships is not just the moment someone gets hurt. It is the slow, calculated process of taking away someone's freedom, confidence, and sense of self long before the first strike ever happens. But the story does not end when the relationship ends. One of the most overlooked consequences of domestic abuse and domestic violence is how deeply they can shape a person's future relationships. When someone has lived for a long period inside an abusive dynamic, their nervous system adapts to survival. Their mind becomes conditioned to read situations through the lens of past harm. That can carry forward in several ways. Some people develop an extreme sense of hyper-awareness in relationships. They may constantly scan for warning signs, overanalyze small changes in tone, or anticipate conflict even when none exists. Their mind is trying to prevent being hurt again. Others may struggle with trust, not because they want to distrust others, but because their previous experiences taught them that love, safety, and harm can exist in the same space. For some survivors, abuse can distort what feels normal in a relationship. If someone has been conditioned to equate intensity, jealousy, or control with love, they may unintentionally gravitate toward familiar patterns without realizing it. Not because they want abuse, but because the mind sometimes recognizes familiarity before it recognizes health. On the other side of that spectrum, some survivors may build extremely high emotional walls. They may avoid vulnerability, closeness, or commitment because opening up again feels like stepping back into danger. Another lasting effect can be a diminished sense of self-worth. Years of emotional or psychological abuse can plant internal narratives such as, "I'm difficult to love. I'm the problem. I cause conflict. No one else would want me." Those beliefs are not truths, but they can linger long after the relationship has ended. For survivors who experience domestic violence, the body can also carry the memory of fear. Loud voices, sudden movements, or conflict may trigger intense emotional responses, even in completely safe environments. This is why healing from abuse is rarely just about leaving the relationship. It often requires rebuilding, trust in oneself, personal boundaries, a sense of safety in connection with others, the ability to distinguish between intensity and genuine care. The most important thing to understand is that the effects of domestic abuse and domestic violence are not signs of weakness. They are signs of someone whose mind and body adapted to survive a harmful environment. With time, awareness, and healthy relationships, many survivors do rebuild a strong sense of self and learn to recognize the difference between control and care, between fear and love. And when that understanding develops, something powerful happens. The patterns that once held someone captive in unhealthy relationships become the very awareness that helps them never walk into those dynamics again. But understanding the effects of abuse is only one part of the conversation. Equally important is understanding how to support someone who has survived it. Many people want to help survivors of domestic abuse or domestic violence, but they unintentionally say or do things that can make healing harder. Not out of cruelty, but out of misunderstanding. One of the most important things a survivor needs is to feel believed. Abuse often involves months or years of being told they are exaggerating, imagining things, or causing the problems themselves. When someone finally speaks about what they experienced, hearing doubt or dismissal can reinforce the very damage the abuse created. Sometimes the most powerful support is simply saying, "I believe you. What happened to you is not okay. You didn't deserve that." Another crucial form of support is patience. Healing from abuse rarely follows a straight line. Survivors may have moments where they seem strong and confident, and other moments where fear, doubt, or emotional pain resurfaces unexpectedly. These shifts are not signs of failure. They are part of the mind slowly learning that it is no longer in survival mode. Support also means respecting a survivor's pace and boundaries. Well-meaning people sometimes pressure survivors to move on, forgive, or trust again quickly. But rebuilding a sense of safety takes time, and that timeline belongs to the person who experienced the harm. Offering consistent support without pressure helps create the stability survivors often lacked in the abusive relationship. Another way to help is by encouraging reconnection with independence and identity. Abuse often strips away a person's sense of self. Supporting their interests, encouraging their goals, and reminding them of their strengths can help rebuild that identity piece by piece. It is also important to understand that survivors may react strongly to situations that seem minor to others. Raised voices, sudden anger, or controlling behavior can trigger memories of past danger. Responding with calm understanding instead of frustration can help reinforce that the current environment is different from the one they escaped. Finally, one of the most meaningful things someone can do for a survivor is simply provide consistent, safe presence. Not someone who tries to fix everything, not someone who judges their healing process, but someone who remains steady, respectful, and supportive as they rebuild trust in themselves and in others. Because for someone who has experienced domestic abuse or domestic violence, the greatest step toward healing is often discovering that relationships can exist without fear, control, or harm. And when survivors are surrounded by people who reinforce that truth, they gain something that abuse once tried to take away: the ability to feel safe, valued, and fully themselves again. Thank you for listening. Till next time.